Hello, and good evening, I suppose. Welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club for the month of March. It's a crazy month, isn't it? Everybody's locked in their houses, and this was supposed to be an in-person thing. We had the flights all arranged, and everything was going to happen, and now we're here. It's just me and Jordan, and Emma's in the room as well. No, it's okay. Don't say I'm sorry, Emma. It's fine. And we're here to talk about a fantastic book, An Embarrassment of Witches. I loved this book so much. And we have with us Jen Jordan and Sophie, I'm blanking, oh my God, Goldstein. Wow, that's the worst, and I'm sorry. And they're both here. Here they are. Talk. Say something. Say hi.
Hi.
Hello.
How's it going?
I'm Sophie.
Very good.
I'm Jen.
Yay! And I'm really glad for you to sit and talk to us on this manner rather than getting sick and us all getting plague. Yeah, comics. That's the question. That's always the first question. It's the first question because it's the best question. Why comics? Of all of the things you could be doing in your life, what is it about comics that you said this is where I'm going to lay my flag?
Well, I have an answer to that. I don't know. I'll just jump in. I originally, when I was in college, I thought that I would be a novelist, or that's like what I wanted to be. So I became an English major because that seemed like the kind of logical route to go. And I, spent 4 years writing analysis of novels. And when I was done, I couldn't write at all. I had complete paralysis because every time I would try, I would just analyze what I was doing and hate myself and and I didn't know that was part of the process yet. That just was a problem. So then I had read comics for years and years, but after college I was working as a secretary, basically, or what they call an administrative assistant, if you want to be euphemistic, and and I took some extension courses at the School of Visual Arts in New York in comics, and I just really liked it. It had it kind of helped short circuit the issues I was having with writing, and drawing itself is more of a right-brain activity. So half the time I'm not even engaging that part of my brain that has those difficulties. So. And then I just kind of kept doing it.
Interesting. Jen?
Yeah.
That is super interesting, and I think my story kind of dovetails with that a little bit. I had read comics since I was a teenager, but I had never really thought about writing them until after college, I would say. I had also started out as a sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed English major, wanting to be a novelist. But something had convinced me that English was a sort of irresponsible major, and so I switched to history, which 36-year-old Jen is history is just as useless as English. But at the time, in 2003 or whatever, it sounded more responsible. So I shifted into writing history, and I also encountered problems because there's just a lot of producing lots of analytical writing in grad school. And writing comics with Sophie has become, it started as a really nice escape, a different, a kind of writing that I could do that was immediately rewarding and fun and not so stressful,
Yeah. So Sophie, you said that you were at SVA. I actually didn't know that they offered classes that were not part of a comics program directly.
Yeah. Well, this was, when was this? This was 2010.
Okay.
So I don't know what the situation is now, but they do have, at the time they had extension courses. And I think I was very fortunate because my first class that I took was taught by Tom Hart. who now runs the Sequential Artist Workshop in Florida.
Yeah.
And he's a wonderful, very inspirational, emotional, kind of inspiring guy. And then the second class I took was with Matt Madden, who went on to write How to Make Comics with Jessica. I don't remember the title, but with Jessica Abel, we made that like master class book, and he's taught all over. And he had a much different and much more like analytical approach to comics. And so I think that I really lucked out. And actually, in the Tom Hart class, Fox Brown was also in that extension class.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow, I mean, I literally didn't know that there were extension classes like that. I thought that was all part of the, sort of the degree program or whatever. That fascinates me. I now I have this picture of like housewives learning about comics. Do you know what I mean? Like as an extension class?
Well, it was it wasn't housewives really. It was more like the other guy that I really remember from that class is this like older, like middle-aged. I mean, now he doesn't seem that old, but at the time he seemed like really old. And he was making these comics using the Poser application that artists use to like have models, and so he like did these elaborate scenarios with like naked women in Poser, and then he would like print out those, and it was.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Real weirdos in a
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. Jen, did you study comics at all in school, or was it just traditional, English writing classes?
No, I took a couple creative writing classes where I wrote short fiction, but that was really the only extent to which I had ever really studied fiction writing of any kind. I've been in a lot of history writing classes since then, but I've never really taken any formal classes in comics writing or drawing. It's really has been my outlet from grad school, and it's sort of I'm gravitating more and more toward it as a thing I want to pursue.
Yeah. So I guess the next question might be, how do you two work together to write a script together? What's the process of that?
Well, it's interesting because in all of the years that we've been writing together, which is over 10 years now, 12 years maybe, we've never really, we spent maybe about a year of those 12 years in the same city. And otherwise, we've been in different states or different countries, working with different time zones. And so we've developed a completely synchronous but sort of dislocated writing process where we have set online times where we would write, and it was done entirely in Google Drive. So we would have brainstorming sessions where we would plot out the individual pages or arcs, and then once we had a kind of rough outline in place, we would choose pages to work on. And so I would write pages like 5 through 10, and Sophie would work on like 10 through 15. And we would bang out our first drafts on our own. And then when each of us was done respectively, we would swap and do edits on each other. And so we developed this really interesting collaborative process where we actually never had to be in the same place. And I think, it's funny because when we were starting this book, when we were starting Embarrassment of Witches, our first brainstorming session happened while Sophie was in New York City. She was you were cat sitting for somebody. I can't remember who.
Oh yeah, I actually was cat sitting for Bob Skoriak and Creota Wilberg. So I was like in a home of comics.
That was so nice.
Yeah,
and I remember sitting at a table with you, and I'm being like, I actually don't think I could do this with Sophie in the room. Like, I think we need to be in rooms alone on opposite sides of the country or opposite sides of the world.
Yeah, I remember in that session I had like brought all these big note cards, and we wrote themes on them and like pasted them on the wall, and we're like, almost doing like the yarn conspiracy thing, trying to figure out the whole arc of the book. Yeah, I think that was the only time that we were in person doing that. And the rest of the time, we actually, we do it. We even talk through chat because it's just, I think in some ways it's really conducive to writing, to not be talking, because you don't need to fill silence when you're chatting. So if you need to take a minute to go write something down, you're not like, oh no, this person is they can hear me drinking coffee.
Yeah, it's really a best of both worlds situation, because you have the person who is there collaborating with you, so you have somebody to bounce ideas off of in the moment, but also you don't have that pressure of somebody physically in the room with you where you're I need to produce for this person right now. You know, so it's works really well for us.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Were you doing? You did, obviously. You guys were working in comics before you did Embarrassment.
Yeah, so we first foray that I really had into comics was with Jen when we were doing Darwin Carmichael is Going to Hell, which was this webcomic that we did between 2009 and 2013. And so we wrote that together and I drew it. And then, after we finished that, by the time that we were finishing that, I was in grad school at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And then I went on to do a couple books on my own. I did one with Ad House called The Oven, and then I did House of Women with Fantagraphics. Mm-hmm. And somewhere in that timeline, we started talking about the next book that we wanted to do together, and we started writing it. And Jen was doing off being a grad student and doing important medieval digging.
I was. Darwin ended right around the time when I was pitching my dissertation prospectus, which is the last part of your coursework before you go off and do independent writing. And so Darwin ended at a pretty good time, I think, for the both of us, because we both had things that we were working on. But then as I got further and further into the dissertation process, which is pretty unstructured, and it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, it can be very unrewarding in the day-to-day. And we started this project sort of in the midst of that. And it became actually something that made me more productive at my dissertation, because there was something that came easily and was fun and was not stressful, which made it a little bit easier to sort of float through the tough writing.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the webcomic maybe just a little bit. I'm curious as to, and I'm always curious about this about webcomics, about when you're doing webcomics in your head, is it more about just trying to tell your story and have an audience? Because the monetization of webcomics seems next to impossible to me, right? Am I wrong on that, right? It's really hard to make money doing that.
I would actually really disagree with that, because I think it might be harder if you're trying to get into webcomics now, because it looks like it's a very different landscape than when we were doing webcomics. Yeah. But a lot of the people that I know that were doing webcomics at that time, they made a decent living off of it. And I think part of it is you build up a very devoted, small, compared. So, if you're publishing through a publisher and they have for example, our book is from Top Shelf. They're distributed through IDW's network. So our book is in comic book stores and bookstores all over the place. It's very easy to get. It's in libraries, and that's great. But, and this is not just Top Shelf, this is any sort of deal like this. The percentage of each book that we get through royalties is very small, as opposed to someone who, for example, Evan Naum, who did Rice Boy and now has another ongoing comic, has been doing webcomics for years. So, he'll do his comic online, and then he'll do a Kickstarter. And in that Kickstarter, once the printing is paid for, Evan gets all of the profits.
Sure.
So even though the number of books that sold may be a lot lower, the profit share is much higher. So I think that it's actually a model that works really well. And then now you have things like Patreon, which we didn't have at the time, which, you know, for those who aren't familiar with Patreon, it's a program where people become patrons of specific creators, and they pay like a low monthly rate, and it varies from creator to creator and what you get from that. But, you know, it can be anywhere from $1 to like $10 a month or higher, I guess. And you know, if you have like 60 people giving you $5 a month, that really adds up.
Sure.
So for some of these web cartoonists, they're making thousands of dollars a month off of Patreon because they've taken the time to build this devoted fan base. It's a very different way of doing business.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very viable model.
Oh, I think it's viable, but I think overall you've got to have those particular skill sets, right? And I don't know that I believe that most creative people naturally have that business skill set as well, you know, because it's very much a kind of, in my mind at least, a right brain, left brain kind of thing, you know. Even in the world of print comics, when I look at self-publishers, there's, you know, so few people who are successful at that to run the business side of it and also create great art. You know, it's a difficult path to take.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And for some people, like Johnny Wander with Yuko and Ananth, they're a couple that do comics together, and Yuko draws it, and Ananth writes it, and I know Ananth, I think Ananth like also handles all of the business aspects, so in that way they have this like partnership that kind of works towards that. But the truth is that even in traditional publishing, like more and more of the onus to promote the book has shifted onto the creator than how it used to be. And I think part of that is just social media. Like there's an expectation that creators are going to you know, be present on Instagram and Twitter and be building their audiences through that. So I don't really think anybody gets out.
Oh, sure. No, absolutely. I guess that leads to the question is do you feel as a creator yourself, as an artist, that you have A, the bandwidth, and B, the skills to be able to maintain and grow that social media aspect of on your own? I'm sorry, I didn't mean that to be a heavy question. I'm just, you know, because every creator has different skill sets and every creator has different ways that they can do things, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say that Jen is really good at Twitter.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you can really kick butt on Twitter. You're really good with those one-liners, and like, you know, you have the whole thread of the funny license plates, like, you know, so just like being, having a kind of way of being that works with a certain platform. I think some people, it's not like, if it feels like work, you're probably not going to be good at it. But if it's something that you enjoy, like you enjoy being on Twitter, you enjoy interacting with people, then it's going to work. Unfortunately for me, I hate all of it. So, so I don't know. I do promote myself on things like that, but I think like if I don't have a book that I'm promoting or something, I just kind of like fade out, and I'm not maintaining those relationships the way Jen is by just, you know, having hilarious things happen that she can talk about. And you know, you had that like what was that tweet that you had that went viral?
Oh yeah, my sister, who I think is watching right now, hi Steph, found a document in her supply closet. She used to be a public school art teacher in a high school in Florida. And she was cleaning out her supply closet, and she found a police report from the mid-'80s from a sort of small precinct, I think in Illinois, I want to say, that was informing police officers. It was sort of like an informational thing about basically what we know now as the Satanic Panic. And it was teaching cops how to identify Satanism in teenagers. So it's stuff like, is your teenager moody and spending a lot of time alone in their room? Like, does your teen have a computer with a password on it? Which is like, oh my God, everybody has a computer with a password on it now. But like all these things, it was like a really fascinating document. And so I just put some stills of it up on Twitter, and it took off. Like it went pretty viral, and it was a weird experience because you get a lot of attention, and some of it is really good if you're a person who likes attention, which I basically am. But it's not all good attention by any means at all. So
yeah, no, it sounds like my son is a Satanist. Then is what it sounds like.
I mean, I feel like we all go through a Satanism phase.
It's like pretty much, Just to stay on the webcomic part for just another minute. So two parts of that. Is it still up?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What's does it say the URL just so that or how to find it?
It's dcisgoingtohell.com.
Very good. All right.
But does not refer to the city. It refers to a man named Darwin Carmichael. So we were prescient, but not that prescient.
Very good. And we're so, again, we've talked about a couple people who have been successful monetizing the webcomic. Were you guys able to monetize the webcomic?
Well, we had a Kickstarter that was successful.
Okay.
So we did, our goal was 12,000, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and we did around double that.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I think we would have been in really good shape if and then in my hubris, I was the one who was talking to the publisher, the printer in China. And I noted that for only a couple $1,000 more, we could get twice as many books printed.
Yeah.
So 1,000 books to 2,000 books. So fast forward 12 years, we both still have so many boxes of books. I moved them between like 3 different states.
Oh, wow.
And I will probably die and be buried under a pile of Darwin Carmichael books.
That's interesting too, because as a retailer, right? I always find Kickstarter interesting because when I look at it from the outside, it always appears to me that people are always just trying to fill their Kickstarter rather than grow their own brand and have stock and things like that. As a direct market retailer, I think that the success ultimately in comics comes from when you have your 6th and 7th and 8th books in print, and the audience will go, oh, this is an author I should pay attention to now, because there's enough material that's in print overall, and one book then sells the other. And if I had a criticism of most people's Kickstarters, is that they're not printing extra stock so that they have it for the long term, and yet you're saying, oh, it didn't work in your case.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have been selling them all along, and I think that probably we've made a good amount of money off of it over a number of years. But it just, personally, it's not fun to do fulfillment.
Yeah.
Understood.
I mean, we have seen a little bit of an uptick, I think, since this book has come out.
Yeah.
I've definitely been sending out a couple more orders per month, I would say, since this book is out. And so that's like a nice side effect. And, right now, like, I have a couple to ship out, and that's probably the only reason I'm going to leave the house for for the undetermined future. So
The essential business of making sure that our readers get their books.
Yeah.
You need the dick jokes we wrote when we were 25.
Oh, I very much understand that. Yeah. Okay, so Sophie, the oven. The oven was the year that it came out, and I don't remember what year it came out, but that year, I thought that was one of the single best graphic novels that came out that year. Not just from a craft perspective, but I thought it was just such an original science fiction idea. So what's the process of doing a graphic novel on your own? We'll talk about working on something together more, but I'm always super curious about that. I've got an idea that I just got to do it by myself, you know?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I am glad that you liked the book so much.
I loved it. No, genuinely. I thought it was really a fantastic book. Yeah.
Oh, I believe you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's not so much like a choice about doing something with Jen or doing it alone. And, you know, it's not like, oh, is this story a good fit for collaborating or not? It's just kind of something that is generated entirely out of myself. Like the work that I do with Jen or other collaborations, of which there are very few others that I've done, they come from bouncing the idea back and forth, and through that process, it becomes whatever it's going to be. And when you're doing a book alone, you're kind of doing that just with yourself, which I think is it's an interesting process, because I feel like I learn things about myself through making these books. And then having people read them, and then having people write about them, and then they're like, "Oh, this reviewer says I'm obsessed with motherhood." Am I? But so like you learn things about yourself through that process. So, but they can also be like hard because you don't have anyone else to go to, and you can just get stuck, and then you have to dig yourself out of it. Yeah, so I don't know. It's the early part of like coming up with a story is more amorphous than the later part of like drawing it and things like that, which for me are pretty structured. Those early stages of coming up with a story are just kind of like pulling the bits and pieces and sitting down and like trying to make them fit together.
Yeah. Well, it's always the laziest question that a person asking about a book can ask is, where do you get your ideas? You know, because obviously it's not there's not a shop that you go to down the corner and, you know, purchase some ideas, right? It's a process. But the mechanical part of creating a comic is labor, as opposed to airy ideas, I suppose. Is that fit with your view of it as well?
Yeah. I do think like, when I'm writing, I have to be in silence. It usually has to be in the morning, and I can't have any distractions. Whereas like, there's kind of a sliding process. So drawing is like, all right, I can like listen to a podcast or the radio or something, and I can do it like later in the day. And then inking is like entirely brainless for me. It's just, it is essentially tracing. And then coloring is a little bit more intensive, because there's just more choices that you're making. So it's kind of like it's how much brain effort versus like physical effort. There's a little bit of a dichotomy there.
Yeah. I'm curious about world building. The notion of creating something completely from scratch. It's never completely from scratch, right? Because we're always a product of our influences. But as I said, I thought Oven had such a great science fiction concept behind it. Embarrassment of Witches has such a great kind of fantasy construct behind it. How much are both of you putting into the work before a single word is written, a single line is drawn, to build those worlds. Talk about that process a little bit.
Do you want to give it a shot, Jen?
Sure. Well, I think if I remember correctly, we did have pretty substantial conversations about the world that the story would take place in before we ever really talked about characters in their specifics. We had talked about a world where magic was sort of omnipresent and was a part of everyday life, but because of that was also sort of invisible, like the way that like time is, like time governs our lives, but like unless you're a philosopher, you don't spend a lot of time like thinking about the nature of time or like how time works or, So we had really kind of talked about like, what it would be like to live and work in a world like that, I think, before we started to think about who would populate that world. And that's, I think, has been a pretty essential process to both stories we've worked on together, because Darwin was like that too. We had a lot of talks about essentially that was also a sort of everyday fantasy world that was more geared toward a thing where like all mythologies were true, and so you have a lot of deities and mythological figures sort of brushing up against everyday New Yorkers. But we did want to think about what it's like to live in a world where magic is like banal and maybe like annoying because it's part of your job as a part of, as opposed to like something awe-inspiring or wondrous in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely I would second that. I mean, in the show that I think of a lot, that in some ways is similar to what we do with Embarrassment of Witches with Darwin Carmichael, I think, is like BoJack Horseman. The storylines of BoJack Horseman are very rooted in kind of like normal emotional experiences or things that are kind of relatable. I mean, as relatable as you can find, like a washed-up Hollywood star who lives in a mansion and is a depressed alcoholic. Like, okay, maybe that's not really all our lives, but like you could easily do that without him being a horseman. Yeah. But a lot of the humor of that show comes from the mishmash of having like a world that has animals that talk and have jobs and all that sort of stuff. So I think that for us, it's very similar. Like the central storylines of the relationships and the struggles that Rory and Angela go through in the course of Embarrassment of Witches are, drawn from our own experience of being 20-somethings recently graduated from college and dealing with relationships and stuff. But the lightness and humor comes from having a magical world that they're dealing with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I suppose I have to ask the question of, obviously magical worlds or worlds where magic is common. We immediately think of Harry Potter, things like that. How much of an influence was that? Did it influence your thinking at all, actually?
Well, I think, you can't deny Harry Potter. Like Harry Potter is everywhere. So when you're doing a book about like magic, you have to at least consider it in terms of like how like what you're not doing or how it's different from that. So, Harry Potter is a book that's written for kids, and ostensibly, and and it takes place in a magical world. There's like the real world, and then there's like the magic world, which is secluded and secret. Mm-hmm. So that is already a big difference from
Absolutely.
our. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that there's like there's some points of like crossover with Harry Potter. I mean, we both have like some of the same mythological creatures in them in our books that show up because. We're sharing a single mythology that we're all drawing from, which is like, the European mythology of magic. But I don't think there was anything I don't think we really talked about Harry Potter a lot. I think the book that we both really love and talked about more was Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which we both really love that book.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of story inspiration were movies that did not take place in a magical world.
Sure.
And something that, it just occurs to me now that's kind of interesting is that with Harry Potter 2, with the actual figure of Harry Potter, you have this sort of like audience avatar, who is also new to magic along with you, the viewer. And so you experience it all through his eyes, and it's all like awe and wonder and amazing. But, we're telling a story about like a world where magic is sort of like built in and it's threaded into everyday life, and you're kind of just like tossed in.
Sure.
Like you have to kind of like, you get thrown into the deep end and you have to sink or swim, which is like a very, I think, familiar feeling to people in their mid-20s, which all of our characters are, and I think like there's a lot of that just sort of, I don't know, that feeling of just having to sort of like, you're out of college now and you're being thrown into a new world that operates by totally different rules. Like there's a sort of like a weird mirror universe Harry Potter happening there.
Absolutely. No, and I don't want to I don't want to make you think that I invoked Harry Potter as, oh, you've stolen from it or something like that. Obviously, there's many sources that could be similar. It's just a touchstone that we all have. And I always wonder about when you're world building, where you take those threads from. I could easily have said the Magicians as much as Harry Potter, right? In fact, the Magicians is probably a closer analog in a way, in terms of it being about 20-somethings, as opposed to elementary school or junior high school students. Harry Potter's both, I suppose. And so obviously it's a very different kind of thing there. I wasn't trying to be reductive in that sense, there's so many places to take inspiration from. That's always a thing that I wonder, that what are those sources of inspiration, and how does that influence you as a creative person?
It's such a big question. I mean, I think that the process of coming up with stories is much harder to just like maybe you can sometimes look backwards and talk about the things that influenced you, but when you're in the moment, you're not like drawing like, I'm going to take 10% of Harry Potter, 30%. It's just kind of like coming together organically through, you ingest all of these stories, and then they like roll around like in the rock tumbler of your subconscious, and then they come out again. But I think a lot of the magic in the book is more like things that we were wanting to explore certain aspects of being a person, and like these things became different. The magic was a way to do that. Like they have familiars in this book, and I like the Golden Compass, where they have their daemons, and I remember reading that book when I was teen, I think, and just being like just desperately like wanting a daemon. Like I was like, oh, true happiness would be having a best friend who's furry and was with you all the time. And so I think that there's something really romantic, not like but in the classical sense of romantic, about the idea of having an animal familiar. So Rory and Angela have familiars, but instead of being like these like little cute cuddly creatures, they just criticize them all the time. And they become a way for, they become a foil for our characters, so they have someone to talk to about the problems they're having with each other, or, we have some fun. And then that led later to us being like, wouldn't it be fun to have a scene of the familiars talking to each other? So it's just kind of like naturally, like as you build this stuff, you find it comes like back around in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were those particularly that aspect of it, was it in the original pitch or the original thought, or was that a thing you found when you were knee deep in writing it?
The familiars?
Yeah, well, and the relationship that the familiars have with each other as well.
Mm.
Do you remember, Jen?
I think we had familiars from the beginning, but I don't think we really had any plans for them to interact among each other or between each other until we realized that we had written two very different familiars, who it would be fun to see interact. Like a lot of that process, I feel like is influenced by our having written webcomics where, this is a book that we wrote that had a very explicit like beginning, middle, and end, but our webcomic was something that had a beginning and then it had a sort of a middle that like lasted as long as we were interested in having a middle, and then we started to write an end as we like decided we wanted to wrap it up. And while we were in that middle, one of the ways that you generate ideas, which I imagine is similar to writing a novel series or a TV series or anything, is like, all right, well, like, have we put these two characters together yet? What would happen if these two people had a conversation? Or, so part of it is just that sort of, now when I write, it's sort of naturally part of the process for me is like, who haven't we seen together yet? And what sort of like funny situations might that generate? Yeah, no, that makes a tremendous amount of sense to me.
Let's talk about that sort of the endless middle versus the structure of a graphic novel. I don't even know that I have a question necessarily that's specific, but that seems like a really ripe area to talk about sort of your creative process of how does that work? Go ahead, Jen, say something.
Well, I guess, when we started the webcomic, it pretty much started as a sort of one-off, a gag a week strip.
Yeah.
Like we would write 6 panels that led toward a joke, or maybe like 2 strips, in a given week that led toward a joke. But as we got more comfortable with the characters, we started to write longer and longer arcs. And so that middle talked about was not quite as amorphous as it may have sounded. Like we had sort of structured arcs that themselves had beginnings, middles, and ends. But we sort of designed the story to be able to have all these arcs that would push the characters forward and develop them as people and, give them opportunities to grow. But also there was a certain amount of like, we're also are going to reset the story, so we can tell another story next time, So that was like very different, I think, when we set out to write this book, is that, when we began Darwin, we knew who our characters were at the beginning of the story. And then the story revealed who they were in the end and who they became. But with this, and maybe, I don't know if you thought this way too, Sophie, we kind of had to decide who we wanted our characters to grow into, sort of before we set out, because we had a sort of more determinate end that we wanted to work toward. We didn't really know where Darwin was going to end until we were several years into it, I would say. Like we had no idea what we would ever do for an ending until it sort of, we really, really got to know the characters. I feel like with this, we had to like know the characters inside out before we really got to that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would definitely, I would second that. And then I think that one of the things, like after the experience of doing the webcomic with Jen and then doing some other books, I wanted to, with Jen, do a story where it was a completely written before I started drawing it. And I think that, part of that is like when you're writing a whole book, you're writing forwards, but you're also writing backwards. Like as the story develops, you're like, well, I kind of have a different understanding of this character, and so you go back and you kind of edit the earlier parts to fit with your developing understanding. And when you're doing that, when you're doing webcomic, like there's no going back and editing it.
Yeah.
It's like, I remember there was this interview, or someone told me about this, with George R.R. Martin, where he's talking about like the first appearance of Tyrion in Game of Thrones, and when you first see Tyrion, he like does a flip off of a banister, sister or something. And
Yep.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. And later he's like, oh, I really wish I hadn't written that because like that doesn't fit at all with who Tyrion like was in the later books, and how he experiences like being in his own body. So I think like, you know, the opportunity of a book is to really like have it work together completely as a cohesive whole. Because you are going through that entire process before the first page is drawn.
Yeah. And well, but as a creator, Sophie, what do you prefer, one or the other? The serialization and the discovery and all the things that brings versus that sort of the narrowing of the concept in a book.
Well, I would say that in my experience, writing a book is like I think it makes it better to do something where it's completely written beforehand, but it can also be way more onerous in terms of, you know, so it takes away some of the excitement.
Yeah.
Like you're working week to week. I think it was more fun than writing a whole book beginning to end. And like with, you know, Jen and I collaborated very, very closely on the script and the story. And then when I was drawing it, like there were long periods when we wouldn't talk because like, you know, Jen wasn't part of that process unless I ran into an issue. Like there were times where I was like, emergency meeting, we need to come up with a bunch of puns about stores in this mall. We have to do it. Or like emergency meeting, we need magical course book titles. Yeah. But the rest of the time it was just me on my own. So, you know, like it's not as much fun, but you know, I don't think like one of the things that I think I've learned from making books is it's more fun to be a reader. I thought that making comics, or like I thought writing novels and making comics, I thought it would be the same, it'd be as good an experience to be that writer as it would to be the artist, but it's just so completely different, and it's not nearly as magical as when you're encountering the finished product. Like I don't think I could ever feel the way about my books as some of my readers do, because of the relationship that I have with making it.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense to me, and I'm really glad that you brought that up. Yeah, because I think that's part of the creative process that doesn't really get talked about a lot. You know, I'm really glad you said that. I want to sort of just quickly say to anybody who's watching the live stream, we've got a bunch of people watching the live stream. Yeah, Jordan. 20-something people are watching the live stream. So if you have any questions for Sophie or Jen, please put them in the queue, and we're going to get to them in just a minute or two. I have a bunch already. Yeah, and we'll do that in a second. Let me pivot just real fast. I think, Sophie, you said you have a little bit of presentation you can show us of process, and I always love seeing process. I think that's the greatest thing in the world to look at. You know, the thing I'll definitely say is we're something like at 125 or 150 cartoonists that we've interviewed, no one's ever shown me the same thing twice. Hey, it's my face. Hi, Brian. People don't work the same way, and it's one of the things I really love about comics is that difference. So looks like we have a little script page here.
Yeah, so I do have some slides, and this is a page out of the script. And Jen already talked a little bit about the scripting process. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jen.
Gosh, I mean, not terribly. Like, I would say that if we wanted to get a little bit more granular with the writing process, like we would decide how many pages a particular scene would need to be, and like, you know, how many, like, what emotional marks we would need to hit for you know, specific pages, and give ourselves like little milestones like that, I guess. But it was incredibly open-ended besides that. Like, I think as we were writing, we sort of had a lot of free reign to come up with what we wanted to happen in individual scenes or in individual pages. It was easy to surprise ourselves, I think. Like we have like a really, I think, good process by which we're both we tend to come to things with like that sort of improv-y, like yes and spirit, like we don't reject a lot of ideas. We try to entertain everything as much as we can, and yeah.
No, absolutely. I think I don't like this process of us working together is different than what I do on my own, because when I'm scripting my own thing, I tend to script with thumbnails, which I'll show as the next stage of the process. But when Jen and I are working, like this is a page out of a Google Doc. So originally we were just like writing scenes as, on a regular sheet of portrait paper, the way you normally would write in a writing program. But then I realized it wasn't, one of the big differences between a webcomic and a book is like a book has page turn, and it has spreads. So in order to help us think about like the page turns and the spreads, I created this format of like the 2 columns on a landscape oriented page. So so you can actually see like, okay, page 58 is on the left hand side, page 59 is on the right hand side, and it helps us like think in those terms, because otherwise we just had weird spots where it's like, well, this needs to end on a page turn, and the next one just like can't start in the middle. Just doesn't make sense. So then after, we would work through this, and then we had the whole script done, and we edited it or we had friends look at it and give feedback. And we showed it to Chris Staros of Top Shelf, and the next stage was thumbnailing. So here is a thumbnail of page 58. So what I would do is it's like they're actually the original thumbnails are very small. They're maybe like 2 inches by 1 inch around about. And so it's just about figuring out like where the stuff is on the page. So and then where the word balloons are. So this page is different than the way the script is. Like all the same dialogue is there, but in the script there were 4 panels. This on the left hand side, there were 4 panels that had been written out. But then when I was trying to figure it out in the layout, it actually worked better to have this 1 large panel and then 2 smaller panels. So that's some of the stuff that changes when I'm doing the thumbnails, and then I put it into InDesign with the script. So, and that's really just so other people can look at the thumbnailed script and give feedback. So that's the second stage, and then after that, I go to pencils. So my process for penciling is I first of all I print out the guidelines. So these blue lines are printed out on like regular typing paper. And for the first time with this book, I actually took the thumbnail and I blew it up and I printed it in the blue line on the page, just to kind of give me a general idea of where things are, which I found really helpful, because it kind of, there's like a fear of the empty page that can happen when you're starting something, and this kind of like helps you get past that right away, because you're like, all right, so there's like a shape over here and there's like they're like standing over here. It just gives you something to work with. So I do the pencils on the regular printing paper, and I add the text before I print it out. I put the text in there in InDesign, because in this case, usually for the oven for House of Women, I would hand letter all the text. I don't know how else to put this. Jen is wordier than I am.
Yeah.
And I was getting cramps in my hand when I was trying to letter all of it.
Yeah.
So like, nope. Okay, we're using a font.
Is this font based on your handwriting, or is it a font from someone else?
Yeah, it's made from my handwriting. I made it back when this is the same font that I made for Darwin Carmichael, and I've much used it ever since. So I think I paid like $10 in 2009 or something for this font, and it's like the best $10 I ever spent. So then after that, I scan my pencils, and then I print those pencils like 25% up from final print size onto Bristol. The panel borders are added in InDesign, so they're very like crisp and straight. And then I scan that, and then so when I was running this comic on my Patreon account. So for that Patreon account, I was doing just a gray tone on the comic, and which ended up being kind of useful because then later on when I was doing colors, and I actually ended up hiring a colorist, Mike Freiheit, who was helping me out because I had deadlines and coloring takes time. So he was helping me out, and he actually, could kind of grab the shapes that I had created in the gray tones, which already had the shadows and the highlights. So he didn't have to make those. He didn't have to like imitate my style of having like highlights on a helmet or something. He could use the shapes I had already created and then just kind of plug in colors from the palette. So this is how the final colors look. So I can kind of like pop back and forth, and you can see like how it changes, but the shapes are still there.
Yeah.
There's some patterns added and stuff like that. So yeah, there's this palette I think it's 6 colors. It's black and white, obviously, and then there's this kind of like pinky mauve color, and purple and yellow and green. So it's a limited palette, but for me, I found when I was doing the oven, which is just orange and black, and then different combinations of orange and black, I found that a limited palette can be a really great tool because it forces you to think more creatively about coloring. And it also means you're not like trying to pick colors from like the entirety of the like every color ever created, which is just that's bad. Don't do that. So that's kind of the basic process from beginning to end of creating the comic.
Super nice. That said a lot, and I really like that. So I think the solve of the mirroring the comics page in a text document, that's fascinating. You're the first person we've ever done that with, and that makes so much sense to me when I see it like that. Nobody else has ever done it that way that I can think of. That's really a fantastic solve. I really, really, really like that a lot.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that it's very important to be thinking in terms of the spread, because I like to have scenes end on a right-hand page. So when you're page, you're really entering into a new scene, and then you don't want like a surprise to come on a right-hand page, because when you're on your left-hand page, you're still seeing the right-hand page, and it would really spoil it. So it's important to have those things in mind during the writing process.
Yeah, and this is really a fundamental difference about comics than writing traditional prose. Obviously, is that page turn and that how the page works. Sophie, feel free to flip back to your face anytime.
Okay.
Yeah. No, just only because you'll forget otherwise. We've done that a couple of times. Jen, are you also thinking about that page turn when you're writing, or because obviously Sophie as the artist has a probably a slightly more visual sense, or is that not right?
No, she does, and it was definitely, I think, the single biggest transition from writing webcomics into writing a sort of traditional comic, because Darwin was really structured like a newspaper strip.
Yeah.
You know, like it was 6 to 7 panels.
Bump, bump,
like
bump, 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 bump. Yeah.
Yeah, like it was all meant to load on your page at once when you went to the URL in 2009.
Yep.
And and this was like a different rhythm to internalize, because like every page had to have a beat too, but then also like the scenes had to, like, a different way to think about the pacing of a story. You know, with the webcomic was sort of open-ended, and you could sort of make it take as long as you felt as though it needed to take in the moment. And this was, you had to really think about where a scene ending would have impact for not only the next scene, but for the entire book, and how that would offset all the pages after that.
Sure.
It was an interesting way to think about pacing, and it was definitely something that Sophie had to remind me of sometimes.
Yeah.
I think
well, so that becomes the question, right? Is like, how conscious are you? Like this, so there's the two things, right? There's the this is how the page works, and then this is how I'm manipulating the page to work, right? Those are two different ideas in a lot of ways. When I look at, I don't know, someone like Alan Moore, who's clearly manipulating the page as he's writing it, you know, I'm always fascinated by sort of that guts deep level of comics work, you know, where you're breaking the page and re-breaking the page and figuring out where the, you know, that turn is all important. The turn is comics in a way, right? There's no other medium that's the same way, where that spread, that unit becomes the conversation. Or am I overstating it? Or am I understating it?
I think you're stating it perfectly. You know, it's, I guess one of the things that comics make you think about that prose doesn't is sort of how physical space then conveys the march of time. You know, like when you're writing a novel or a short story, that's very fluid, and that's something that you can control with the words that you choose, or how the words are spaced on a page, or whatever, what have you. But this was something that you have, it's a lot more abstract, and at the same time almost mathematical, I would think. Like I had to sort of learn how to think visually, and that was not something that I was ever really I was not prepared at all at first. And I remember Sophie, this from very, very early on in us writing Darwin, where I turned in one page, and I think it was like panel 1. It was like, Darwin opens the door, enters the bank, and takes out $50. And so you were just like, that all can't happen in one panel. Like that's like at least 3 panels. Like, what are you talking about? So like learning also how to break down like actions into their most fundamental representative like shapes. It's also something I had to learn.
Absolutely. And it's a thing you can do in prose. You can say, the person does this and then does that and does that, and it works in prose. It does not work in comics, where someone's actually got to draw those things. I remember Neil Gaiman once talking to me, like the first time he encountered that, about, you know, again, maybe not opens the door and then sees an army, right? Like, and it didn't work. Like, no one could do that. I wonder for you, Jen, especially, do you ever start drawing out on the page? Like, do you do your own thumbnails to see if it works or not? Or do you wait for Jen to go, or do you wait for Sophie to go, no, that didn't work?
I would say I only really did that if I was trying to write a silent page. You know, if I wanted to write a page that didn't have any dialogue, that would be conveyed entirely through characters moving or how their faces changed, that would be something that I would sort of sketch out briefly for myself, because I would have a harder time conceiving of panels without the sort of like dialogue moments that define them.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that we were able to take a lot of the kind of stuff that we built through doing Darwin Carmichael, because in the original script we were still doing a lot of like 6-panel pages, because that was like roughly the amount of text and action that would work on a page. But then when I was thumbnailing it, sometimes I would like combine panels or break it down even further, just to kind of, if you have like two characters talking, you don't want 6 panels of them just facing each other talking, which is totally something I did in Darwin all the time. But I'm much smarter now, and I've learned things. So I don't do that anymore. So I would try and like, how do I make this conversation like visually interesting? So I'd like mix it up with the way the page layout work. But because but the beats still worked. Like then the which pages things were on and the page turns were all retained. I was just kind of like messing around with some of those details of like the number of panels and which where the word balloons fell. Maybe adding, I might add a panel, give like a reaction shot of something. But we do have like, we write in the script, we'd have like panels that just be like beat. We did that. I remember with Darwin that happened all the time. Just a panel, people are like staring at each other before the final joke lands.
Yeah. So this becomes another kind of maybe technical question. It looks to me, when I look at the book, when I flip through the book, for the most part, you're kind of on a 9-panel grid, kind of, right? There's typically 3 stacked layers, and you can usually divide them into thirds. Do you think about it that way, or is that just me receiving the work? I don't know if I asked that question right. I'm trying to think of how. I think there are generally 3 tiers. I used to have like a very highly structured, like 3 tiers, 3 panels per tier, so like a 9-panel grid essentially, that I worked in for a while when I was making like mini comics on my own. But then with when I started doing House of Women, so House of Women it's like a horror sci-fi book that's done in the style of like an Art Nouveau, that's really inspired by Aubrey Beardsley especially, but Klimt, and then also like the Japanese prints that came into Europe at the time and were a huge influence. And a grid just doesn't really fit with Art Nouveau. It's not, Art Nouveau is like very flowing, and you need to have like, it just required something different. So I had to really figure out a different way to approach pages. And so I learned to break things up and have like really tall panels and, bigger like splashes and, bleeds and all that sort of stuff. And I've taken what I learned from doing that book forward into doing other books. And with this book, one of the books that I looked at a lot was Scott Pilgrim, which has been a touchstone for us since the beginning.
Yes.
We've talked about that book a lot for those books. But I still think like Scott Pilgrim has some of like the best comedic timing and pacing of like any comic.
Agreed.
So I looked at that book a lot in like how he broke down his pages and panels, especially for comedic pacing. And that was something that I applied a lot to this book. Yeah.
I wonder about sort of the difference between a rhythm on a 9 and a rhythm on a 16, right? Like it's like different pacing that communicates information differently. Do you think about that, or is that just a thing that kind of works itself out in the end?
Well, the difference is I would never draw a 16-panel page.
Yeah. I think there's a couple in here where there's a 4 grid on this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not necessarily 16 across, but it's a different rhythm than a 3-tiered stack, right? A 4-tier stack is different than a 3-tier stack. Yes? No?
Yeah, no.
I mean, I don't draw comics, so I don't actually know. I only process them as a reader, and you know, I always find this part of it, the magic of it is because they're different things and they communicate things differently. You know, it's the difference between a 45 record and a 78 in a way. You know, bump bump bump, like the rhythm of the page. You know, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think, gosh, well, I mean, if you have like a 16, some of the pages, there's one page where Rory is, it's just a repeated shot of her, and in each panel she's like, oh, I love, marketing, or I love, cleaning hallways. She's like applying for jobs. And so in each panel, she's essentially like telling the person who's interviewing her, like, that she desperately wants to be a data analyst. Yeah. So that's a 9-panel page. And like, the fact that each panel is the same, like it's the same shot, and the same like shape.
Yeah. So
that gives you like, you can it gives you the opportunity to really compare. It focuses on her and the difference, like over the course of the page, she just looks like more and more worn out by this.
Yeah.
And the things she's saying get more and more absurd. So that's one of the values of having like a grid, is that it focuses your attention on what's in the panels, because you're not trying to figure out like what the layout is. But it's hard because I think so much of it is intuitive. I think that you read a bunch of comics, and through the process of reading comics, you like ingest those things. And I do exercises like I described with Scott Pilgrim, where I went through that book and I actually drew little thumbnails of pages I liked, and kind of like tried by copying into my notebook those things to ingest them. But then when it came time to actually thumbnail the pages, I wasn't like referring to specific pages in Scott Pilgrim or things.
Sure.
I was just trying to figure out how it worked, and like, it's an amorphous process.
No. I wasn't. That's actually what the thing I was trying to get at is that it is an amorphous process. That there's not a rigidity in telling comics, right? Like comics shouldn't. Well, there are certain comics where having rigidity is good, but otherwise, I was actually curious about how aware in the moment of the 9 versus 16 versus 25 versus 3 are you as a creator? And if the answer is I'm not aware of it at all because in the moment I'm just trying to make the page right, that also is a great answer.
Well, I would say that I'm not counting panels.
Yeah.
That's definitely not. Okay, I'm going to do, I think I'll do a screen share and I'll show a particular page and talk about what I was thinking about when I did that page, and maybe
Fantastic.
that will help explain it. Okay. All right, so let me just...
And while she's finding that, Jen, do you as an author, do you think about the rhythm of the page, the individual units that are getting made, or again, is it fluid for you as a writer?
I would say, I think the reason that it's hard to talk about is because it's like talking about a language that you learned like not from a textbook, but that you learned by talking to people.
Sure.
Whereas like you can speak the language, but like you can't necessarily talk about like the particular grammatical parts or the parts of speech and stuff like that. It really does feel like it's like a rhythm that you internalize. Like it feels like the way that like if you asked a comedian what is comedic timing,
Sure,
like,
sure.
it would be super hard. Like
Sure.
But I think in general, I think the operating assumption I usually use is that like the eye kind of lingers on a page for the same amount of time, like
Yes.
whether it's this 9 or 16 or what have you. And so for me, like more panels sort of means a more frenetic pacing, and like fewer panels is something that, like kind of like stretches out a little bit more. But that's not even like really a good written in stone rule either, because there are some pages that have many, many panels and feel very intricate and like take a lot of time to read. And like, it's really like, it feels like just making a sort of like triage judgment call in the moment, like both as a writer and I imagine like for Sophie, like in a moment.
It's a little different in prose, because in prose, the number of words on a page are what the number of words on a page are physically, right? There's no decision making in that, right? It's just that's what it is. And that's why books digitally are as good as books in print, because it doesn't matter, right? But comics are a different language, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I prefer reading books on paper to reading them on a screen, because I do think that the physicality of reading a book adds to the experience, but
Absolutely.
Definitely not to the degree that like a comic does. With a lot of digital comics reading programs, like you're only seeing one panel at a time, and so you might be losing the entire page, and you're certainly in most cases losing the spread.
Yeah.
So that's entire aspects of very important aspects of the comic that you don't get when you're looking at something digitally, unless you have a very large tablet.
Yeah.
But so to talk about a specific page.
Yep.
So this is like, I think this is the 7th page of the book. It's not a spoiler to say at the beginning of the book, Rory gets essentially dumped by her boyfriend in the airport. Or it's like, he doesn't dump her, he just says that he wants to like have an open relationship. But you know,
I really thought you were going to be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just thought that was like the most withering thing someone could say in that moment.
Yeah.
So to talk about like in these first 2 panels, he's like, let's see, on the previous page, she's saying, "I'm not going anywhere with you." And then here you see it's the same shot, so you're really focused on him like just drawing up the handle of the bag and that moment, and then he drags it off, and then you have this bigger section in the middle, so these 2 stacked panels of Rory, but then you have this big spacious moment of him delivering this cutting line. So I really thought you were going to be cool.
Yeah.
So you get a moment to contemplate that in this like purple space right here, and then you have this little moment of him pulling up to the gangway. And then in the bottom, it's again a repeated image, so you can see Rory just like falling apart as he has his ticket taken and he's going down the hallway and leaving her. So that's kind of like how I was thinking about it, is in little groups of beats. So you can kind of see that these 2 on the top are a pair, and these 3 on the bottom are a sequence. And these 2 panels in the middle of Rory are focusing on her face, and then this big open panel is really focusing on him. So that's kind of like how I go about breaking down a page.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in that particular example, you're marrying both the 9-panel grid and a 16-panel grid. And there's an emotional thing that happens, I think, in the space between the 9 and the 16. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm really getting into the weeds. That's not.
No. I mean, I the weeds is where I live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm just, where is that page I was just looking at? With this is the first page of a sequence that's a flashback of them in a restaurant where they're celebrating that Rory just graduated college. So, I mean, some of these things are just about fundamental storytelling. So you have an establishing shot.
Yep.
Because you need to know where they are. And then this middle thing is kind of a back and forth between Rory and her mother. Yeah, right, exactly. So the panels are smaller and narrower, kind of gives it like a little bit of more of a fast back and forth. Mm-hmm. And then you have this break where Holden is delivering this very obnoxious lecture. and it's, you know, a bigger panel of him, and then you get the entire table, so you can kind of see how everybody's individually reacting in that moment, which I think like it's important to see. I mean, I love drawing people more than anything else, so I love to get the emotional responses that people are having in conversations.
Yeah.
So
I'm with that, man. I love the language of comics and the rhythm of comics. That, you know, this really that's a really, you know, now that we're talking about it, you can really see the wah bump 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 wah wah. You know, and you can hear it when you. I don't know. To me, comics are like music in a way, but there's no sound of any kind.
Yeah, I think Chris Ware has compared comics to music, and that's the form that he thinks is closest.
Yeah.
For him.
Yeah, well, and he's working in 25s, right? Like he's at this like incredible fucking rhythm when you look at his page as it's structured. You know, it's bump 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 because it's all little fucking panels. You know, yeah. Maybe let's do some questions because we have some questions stacked up, and
that is true.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have Jordan ask them because he's there.
Hey, can you hear me?
You can hear Jordan?
Yeah, great. All right. So the first question was, how was this is from that guy 04444.
4444.
And how was collaborating on this book different than working together the first time?
What would you say, Jen?
I would say in the day-to-day, it didn't feel particularly different. I mean, maybe to the extent, I would say the one difference for me was that Darwin was written with this constantly shifting deadline, right? Like, because at first, for the first year or so, we would publish 2 strips a week. Then we moved to like a 1 strip a week schedule, and we would have like buffers of various lengths at different points, where we would have like, you know, 2 or 3 months of comics like in the tank that were just ready to like kind of upload and go. But then when we had a lot of like assignments for our various like school projects, that tank would empty out. You know, we'd have like fewer to sort of fall back on. Then we'd have to write and generate and draw a lot. So there was like a deadline that sort of kept us producing, I would say, like at a, if not consistent rate, then like in a cyclical way. Would you say that, Sophie?
Yeah, totally.
This was more like we were kind of doing this around other projects too, so this felt like a little bit more open-ended, I would say, because we didn't really have any external deadlines for this particular project bearing down on us. So the writing took a while because we were writing it in between other things, and then it just felt, I think, a little bit. It felt different in that way. There was less external pressure, and then maybe like the process felt a little bit, how would you say, like more dynamic. Like Darwin was like, okay, we're gonna sit down, we're gonna have to generate like 14 pages today just to, you know, like get enough for us to like work on. This was like we just worked until we felt like we couldn't work anymore. You know, like I don't really know if I'm communicating the difference properly, but.
Well, I mean, just to like give an indication, like it took me about a year and a half to draw the book. But no, that's not right. Like two years to draw the book. But the entire process of making this book, from when we first started talking about it to like when I finished drawing it, was 5 years. So 3 years of that was us like neglecting this project.
Yes.
And then meeting up occasionally, be like, what was this book about? Like, where were we? Oh, right, we talked about that in text, in a like text conversation. Now we have to work that in. So it pretty much took a backseat to like everything else for the longest time, which is fine. I think that's like the nature of how some of these things work, but it didn't mean that the writing process took like a really long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so next question. The next question I have here is from a Michael Goldstein. which was, did a lot of what you read as a kid and teenager have a big impact on coming up with later ideas for your own books, Sophie?
Sophie.
Well, Dad, let me address this question. Yes, I would say absolutely it did. One of the conversations that I had with my father at one point, when I was younger, he would take me to these used bookstores, and I would just like get like these stacks of books, most of which were like schlocky fantasy books by like Piers Anthony, just to give you an indication of the level at which this is working at. And then he would always he would always try and push me towards like novels and stuff, so I'd get my vegetables essentially. But at one point, I remember him saying, I finally get like where all those books you read paid off. Like I see where how those books that you read as a kid like turned into the work that you're making now, and that was really nice to hear. So I definitely think that being allowed to buy fantasy books helped my development as a creator down the road. Thank you.
Good job, Dad.
All right. So the next question I've got here is for Jen. It's from Carl. And
What's
Jen,
happening now?
how much did your work in history inform the writing here?
Did we know?
I don't know.
Huh?
Jordan?
Are you with us?
Oh, we can't hear him.
Sorry. Jordan,
Okay, I'm ready.
try that.
How much did your work
Uh-oh.
in history inform the writing here?
Did you get that? How much did your work, Jen, in history inform your writing here?
Oh, a fair degree, I would say. That's something that was pretty consistent from Darwin as well. I've been in a program for medieval history. I'm getting a PhD for the past 10 years. It's a little bit too long, but it's been a good 10 years. And I've been really interested in medieval myth. And so Darwin had a lot of weird medieval animals that I had encountered in my research in it that were sort of like Darwin's friends or people who would show up at parties, and they kind of populated the background. And for this project, I remember wanting to sort of tap into a different set of medieval knowledge, like something that could inform the story in a slightly different way. And I think that's how we kind of fell into the cryptozoology idea for the lab where Angela works with Rory's mother. Because there's a really interesting tradition in medieval literature and sort of the medieval construction of knowledge about fake plants. And they're usually often found side by side with all of the sort of fake mythological animals, and so we started to tap into that, and that's where the lambs of Tartary come from. The lambs that grow on bushes. In the Middle Ages, they believed that there were these plants that could basically grow lambs for you, so you could have like a plant source of wool, and the lab is using that to try and create like a vegan meat source. We had also the barnacle geese, which are like another really good fake medieval plant. There's a lot of like animals growing on trees and in medieval culture. They were geese that would basically form from the limbs of trees and fall down into the water where they would swim away, or onto land where they would break their necks and then become food for you. And so I think, I've always really liked to incorporate the medieval stuff that I read into this, because grad school can feel like a silo. Like, it can really be a very isolating experience where you're spending a lot of time alone in a room with like a lot of weird books that you and like 3 other people have read in the last 150 years. And so it was a fun way to make that stuff feel a little bit more alive and relevant for me, and to kind of share what I was working on with other people.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Is there another question, Jordan?
One last question. It's also from Carl, and Carl asks, The color palette of the piece is actually really great. What was your inspiration for that?
Yeah, so thank you, husband, for that.
Thank you, husband.
So it was funny. So when I had to finish the cover for the book way ahead of publication, because that's how the cycle of books works, is they need to go into a catalog that goes out way before the book. And so at that point, I hadn't colored anything. I just had the gray tones. So I was really figuring out the color palette for the book through doing the cover. And I must have done 25 incredibly ugly color palettes for the book. They were just unsightly. And I would send them to Jen. I don't know if you could tell how crazy I was going during that night, the dark night of the soul. But I finally had this like brain flash, and I like looked up Polly Pocket sets from the 90s. Because I had Polly Pockets, and I just remember them having like these really nice, cheerful colors, and so I took like a bunch of photos of Polly Pockets from the 90s off the internet, and I just used the eyedropper tool to just like grab some of the colors, and those ended up being the color palette. Just felt right.
Wow, that's cool. Actually, I really like that. I think that's great.
Yeah, one more.
I think that's great. Jordan says there's one more question. And actually, if you're still watching on the live stream, feel free to ask questions. We're not cutting it here, but Jordan says...
Okay, so
I was wondering if you could speak about your choice to write Rory and Angela as women of color, despite not sharing that background.
We sort of wrote the characters for their personalities first. Because we had a particular friendship dynamic that we wanted to explore, and I think it's one that like is probably like key to a lot of friendships, where there's one person who tends to be to dominate the friendship or to impose their will a little bit more often, and there tends to be one person who goes with the flow a little bit more. And so we kind of wrote character archetypes first, and then we had a whole script in place before we designed the characters visually, right? Like we hadn't any idea of what they were going to look like.
Yeah, I think it's always a kind of a difficult question, as I am Jewish, which Rory is, but which is an ethnicity, but she's also half Mexican American, and then Angela, her family's Korean. So Korean American. So I think that it's difficult as to white people to think. You either do you make all of your characters white, because that just that's only representing a very narrow slice of the American public, or do you create characters of color who have backgrounds that you don't have any experience in? And I don't really think there's a good answer to this. I think that a lot of science fiction and fantasy does take the approach of kind of adding character, that the race of the characters doesn't particularly play into the role that they play in the story, because they take place in science fiction. It might be in a future which is much more advanced. So you don't have the same kind of racism or sexism that we have in our culture, or a fantasy world where you can kind of disregard a lot of that stuff. With Harry Potter, when it came time to make the movies, all of the characters in the original books are white, but in the movies they decided to go with a more diverse cast. So I think it's a complicated question. It's definitely something that we talked about as we were making the book. But I think that defaulting to white characters because we are white also doesn't feel like the right choice. So yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's definitely something that we think about. And there's just no easy answers, really. I definitely wouldn't, I wouldn't try and write someone's experience of racism that I don't experience, but that's a far cry to me than having these two essentially like millennial young women who also happen to be people of color, where the story doesn't really address that aspect of their experience directly. Yeah.
Jen, do you have any thought on that?
No, I think I agree. You stated it a lot more eloquently than I was attempting to say. And I think it really depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. Because some stories are not ours to tell. And they usually are stories about racism or violence or inequity or deep, societal issues like that. And those should be told by the people who are being represented. But we're trying to tell a story about friendship. And about like finding your way in your mid-20s. And I think that that's something that everybody has to deal with. I realize that's sort of edging toward like a sort of everybody experiences the same things, and that's not true at all. But everybody has interpersonal conflict at some point in their life. I think that's like so broad as to be, almost meaningless, but is still true nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about, because this book it's not like quite YA, but it's like on the edge of being YA. It's for for 20-somethings, and teens to 20-somethings is kind of like the target audience. And I think that in those kinds of books particularly, you see people make an effort to have a more inclusive cast of characters, because you're thinking about the people reading this book is that, especially younger readers, like it's important that they see themselves in books and in comics. And so just thinking about like just creating more white characters when there's already so many books where the entire cast is white, that just doesn't seem like adding value
Sure.
to comics. So I wanted people to be able to look at this book and to see themselves in it, and not just think that this is only these experiences, like that there aren't people of color in a magical world.
Yeah.
Which is true of so many magical worlds that you see where you don't have that kind of representation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would even say I'm of the age that I remember when you didn't see women in worlds. I mean, let alone of color. We're in a better place now. I think the comics is legitimately engaging everyone, and I think that's really fantastic.
Yeah, there's definitely pushback about that, but I think it's overall heading in a really good direction. I mean, like when you think of like early fantasy, like not Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
where it's like white men, and like specifically of like European mythology coming from Europe and European roots. And with the movie series, they added some more significant roles for women, but you still don't see people of color in the movies unless I'm misremembering. And then also there's often like this coding of like darker skin is evil. Like you see a lot of like the bad, like the orcs and things have darker skin tones. And I think that that's something that's very important to be conscientious of when you're working within these genres. And to not like fall into those tropes, of like othering and like using these stereotypes that kind of come from our world and like have infected these genres.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's very apt, and I think that's very smart. And I think the thing that's fantastic about comics and the moment that we're in comics is that there are comics for everyone. I don't know. I just feel like we're moving past that, and I think that's great. I want to make a little, just tiny pivot back to craft here at the end. Can we talk about the production of work? And you mentioned at one point, maybe 20 minutes ago, that this took you 5 years between conversation to execution. Once you're in the execution phase, though, what's your production like?
What's my day-to-day like?
Yeah.
Well, so the first, Jen, if you want to jump in here, but I'm just going to talk about drawing the book. Yeah, so for the first year that I was drawing the book, I was living in Pittsburgh. I had a home studio, and I had a lot of other projects that I was doing as well because I had to take freelance work, to live. And so, anytime a freelance project would come in, I would have to put an embarrassment of witches aside because, we didn't get a large enough advance for the book that I could live off of it, which is often the case. And then I got this fellowship that I'm currently in the studio, the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. And it's, you get a studio space, you get a stipend, you get housing. And it was so in that first year that I was in Pittsburgh, I drew 50 pages. And then in the second year, when I was in Tulsa, I finished the book. So that's like, nearly 150 pages.
Right.
So just the ability to focus and not have to take on other work really made it a lot easier. But my day-to-day was just, I would come in, I would always, I would draw first, and then I would ink or color. And I usually would set it, I had a timer that I would use. So I do an hour and a half stints, and I would do 3 of those in a day. And so I do an hour and a half of drawing, and then I take a little break, check my email, go to the bathroom, and then I do an hour and a half of inking and a break, and then an hour and a half of probably more inking or coloring or something. I usually only drew for like an hour and a half a day because that takes it out of me more.
So and in that hour and a half, we're talking about a page, 2 pages. What would you say is your output in that time? Overall, not.
Maybe like a page and a half.
Yeah.
In an hour and a half, I can probably ink 2 pages. I mean, some of the pages were a lot more work than other ones, but assuming that it's not like a page with the interior of a cathedral on it, that would be about my average.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense to me. I think my next question would be the book, their arcs come to a point, but could you go back to this world, to these characters again? Do you have an intention to do something else?
I think we do. I don't want to give too much away, but we definitely want to take some time, I think, because I need to finish my PhD, eventually. And Sophie probably wants to live other aspects of her life for a little while. But we love these characters and we love the world that we made that they live in. And I think that we do want to tell more stories with them. And we've had a couple ideas. Sophie had a really good idea that she's been chatting up with me, and hopefully you'll get to see them.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of, one of the things that we found with Darwin is we had created a world where there's just the world itself generated a lot of ideas. And we could really, we could have stayed and made comics in that for even longer if there hadn't been other stuff that we wanted to do. But as we did Embarrassment of Witches, I think we also were there's just more we can do with this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the question is that with Rory or is that with the world? In other words, is it Embarrassment of Witches Part 2, or is it just something set in the same universe?
I think it's both, because if we would have the characters continuing their journey, but then also be exploring different aspects of the world. If this happens.
Yes.
Sure. We have no contract for it.
No, understood.
Our dream. I think we want to spend a little bit more time with these characters, though, and we want to tell different kind of stories, I think, too. I don't know, there's a lot of options out there, and I think that it was something that we had considered with Darwin too. When Darwin finished, we had tossed around for a long time the idea of telling a story in that same world, both totally different characters. I look forward to doing that more with these characters than I would have with the Darwin characters. I think we
Nice.
have a lot more meat to these characters than we
Yeah.
did with our ones.
Nice. So obviously, Jen, you're working on your PhD, but is there something you guys want to plug coming up? Your next thought, your next idea? Is there something in the works? I would love to plug something if we can.
I think we're still really stuck on plugging this book.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
And I'm very much with the PhD. I'm in the squirreled away writing phase. I have a couple chapters to produce by the end of the summer, and so that's kind of where my head is for the next few months. But yeah, we're going to start, I think, talking ideas soon, and you know. Mm-hmm.
And I think so. I have a freelance project that I've been working on that I'm not sure if I can talk about, so I'm not going to. But after that's finished, which is wrapping up soon, I think that I'm probably going to take some time and do some short stories, because it's been a long time since I've done that. And a graphic novel is just like it takes so much to do such a long project, and I want to take a break and do some shorter things where the beginning and the end are just closer together.
Yeah.
So I think that, and also I find with short stories that it allows you to like explore different styles and different places and things. So it's a fun way to kind of stretch your muscles.
Yeah. No, makes a lot of sense to me. The last question then, let's end it with, there's a lot of people who are cartoonists who are watching this as a series. They may be watching it 5 years from now, right? They're not watching it today necessarily. What is the creative advice that you would give someone who wants to work in comics? If you could sort of pick one aspect to communicate to them.
Do you want to start, Jen?
Sure. I would say, I guess, speaking to my own experience, the most powerful thing that I really learned from this is learning how to be more comfortable with failure, I want to say, but not even as severe as that. Like learning how to sort of tolerate an idea, even if you think it might not be the best idea. Like you need to learn how to suspend your own judgment of your work basically while you are working. The part where you judge your work, sort of, for me anyway, like has to come after I am working, or I can't get anything done in the moment. And I think that like learning how to turn off that inner critic while you are working, or even just being able to tell that inner critic, like, okay, just give me 20 minutes, like you need to sort of like suspend judgment like while you are actually creating.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense to me. Sophie?
Yeah. And I would say like on a more nuts and bolts professional note, I definitely, when people start making comics, especially when they're younger, people, they don't finish things. Like there's a lot of starts and not a lot of finishing. And sometimes, often it's because people are really ambitious and they have these, they want to do a comic series, they want to do a graphic novel, they've had these characters that they've been posting about in DeviantArt for years, and they're really invested in it, so they want it to be perfect, so they draw the page and then they redraw the page and then they never get past like the first 10 pages. So my advice, if you're starting out, is to do smaller stories, and to finish them. And if you have a really big project that you want to work on, don't start with that, because, if you don't finish a story, you can never show it to anyone. So finish shorter things, make mini comics, go to comic conventions, and give them to people.
Yep.
That's a great way to get started.
Yep. And I would add to that, go to your local comic stores. Your local comic stores are happy to work with you, is my experience. Mm-hmm. And in my comics experience, we literally do that. We're happy to work with you and to get your word out. Do either of you have a Patreon or a someplace that we can plug right now that'll help you going forward?
I have a Patreon, which I'm going to find the exact. I think it's if you look up my name, Sophie Goldstein,
Yep.
you'll be able to find it. And I think the URL is patreon.com. Yeah, it's patreon.com/Sophie Goldstein.
Nice.
So I'm pretty easy to find, and I serialized this whole book on there while during production with like process art and stuff like that. And as I make more comics, they'll all be on there. So I love my Patreon community and the feedback I get there. So I would love it if people would consider backing me on there.
I endorse this. Jen, you have something?
You can look at my Twitter. I don't make any money from it, but it will entertain you probably.
Yeah.
It's at Jen Lynn Jordan, Jen with 2 N's, Lynn Jordan. I tweet a lot about just dumb things that happen to me and my cats, and also medieval history. There's a lot of medieval history on there. So
Nice. I like that. Awesome. Well, so our book this month was An Embarrassment of Witches by both of them, Sophie Goldstein and Jen Jordan. Sorry, it's been a long day. It's really been a long day. We loved this book, and the staff all loved it, and it's the kind of book we get behind, and we want to support. And I want you guys to keep doing comics. Anything we can do to make that happen. I wanna thank Jordan for being our tech support here and doing things. Say hi to the folks, Jordan. Or maybe
Hello, folks.
Yeah. So Jordan's great. And I want to thank the Beat for sponsoring us, and I want to thank all of our members who are doing this every month and getting a graphic novel of the month. If you want a graphic novel of the month club, graphicnovelofthemonthclub.com/start. That's how it works. And not only do you get a book like this, but you also get like a really super cool book plate. Look at this cool book plate that you can only get from us, and it's signed and it's cool. And that's great. And then next month our book is Graffity's Wall. I think it's pronounced Graffiti, and it's Ram V and a nod RK, and we're gonna have a truly international graphic novel club next month. We have Ram V is in London, and Anad is in Mumbai. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation, I think. Across time zones, and so every month we pick a book, and every month it's a great book, and we love cartoonists and we love creators, and this is what we're trying to do. So thank you guys, Jen and Sophie, for coming and being part of this. Thank everybody for watching. Thank Jordan for producing. Thank the Beat for supporting. Thank you all. Comics, man, read more comics. Yay. Comics are the greatest art form in the universe, and that's really all I have to say. So thank you all, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.